Hello, my name is Carolyn Pedwell. I'm Senior Lecturer in Cultural Studies in the School of Social Policy, Sociology, and Social Research here at the University of Kent. I wanted to talk to you today about some of my current research that was published in my latest book called Affective Relations, the Transnational Politics of Empathy. Now, when I started this project about 5 or 6 years ago, I started following around empathy as a word or a concept. And what I started to notice was how frequently empathy seemed to be being called for as a kind of affective solution to a very wide range of rather complicated cultural, social, and political problems. So whether it was in President Obama's political speeches and memoirs, international development training literatures, or particular strands of feminist and anti-racist theory and practice, empathy seemed to be positioned as what we want, what we need more of. If we could only create more or better empathy, then we would be in a better place. So really, what I was interested in was the relationship that was being posed between the production of empathy and the creation of social justice. Now, one of the more specific things that I became aware of is that of all the emotions, empathy seems to be the one that is most likely to be thought of as a kind of affective bridge between imagined social and cultural groups across geopolitical borders and boundaries. Nonetheless, there's actually relatively little scholarly analysis of how we might understand the relationships between empathy and transnational politics. So, in my project, I wanted to do two key things. The first one was to try to think about the workings of empathy a little bit more critically. Is empathy always a good thing? Is it always appropriate or helpful? Is empathy likely to lead to social justice, whatever that might mean in a given context? Or is it perhaps a little bit more complicated, more ambivalent than those kinds of narratives suggest? The other thing I wanted to do was to try to think in a bit more detail about how we might understand that link between empathy and transnational relations. And I understood transnationality in my project as constituted by a set of shifting and interconnecting processes linked to empire, colonialism, slavery, international development, neoliberalism, capitalism, and migration, amongst other processes and phenomenons. So rather than seeing empathy as an effective solution to complex structural problems, my project wanted to ask what attention to the very different and diverse ways that empathy manifests itself across a range of sites and disciplines might tell us about how contemporary international geopolitics are working. What attention to empathy's travels might tell us about the emotional or affective ways that contemporary politics are taking place. So let me provide you with a couple of examples. One of the things I wanted to think about was how might we understand the relationship between empathy and global capitalism. So we can think about how in the current labor market, empathy is actually being called for in the workplace, in various corporations, as a kind of affective or emotional skill or competency that could be developed to generate forms of capital. And I wanted to think about how when empathy becomes a competency through which you can gain capital, value, and that includes economic profit, how might it work not towards social justice, but actually precisely against it, in a way that might be more likely to create greater inequalities rather than to ameliorate them. Another question that I thought about is, why is it that when empathy is called for as a feeling or a set of affective relations that might improve social or political relations, it's so frequently socially privileged subjects, whether they're privileged in terms of class, geographic location, or other variables, that are called on to develop more or better empathy. Now, this might make sense in certain ways, but if it's always people who are already privileged in particular ways, who are being given the opportunity to hone and refine and develop their affective capacities through empathy. And it's always other less privileged people who are once again simply the object of empathy. How is it that these types of relations again might reproduce or retrench social and political relations of power rather than disrupting them? Now, a third issue that I was interested in this project is how might we understand the links between empathy and practices of translation? So firstly, what role might empathy play in linguistic, cultural, and affective processes of translation across borders and boundaries? But also, how might empathy itself be translated? I think in a lot of these calls for empathy, we assume that it's something universal, something that we know what it is, that everybody has or has the capacity to develop. But what happens when we think a bit more carefully about how empathy might not be understood the same way in different contexts, how it might be produced very differently across borders, how it might actually be felt differently? So, while my project has been quite critical about the fetishization or instrumentalization of empathy as a social or political balm or bridge between groups or solution, at the same time, I didn't simply want to dismiss its transformative potential. So I've also been interested in how we might interpret empathy differently. How might we move beyond that kind of everyday understanding of empathy as the act of putting oneself in the other's shoes, to try to think about empathy as involving a broader set of processes involving affecting and being affected? What happens if we could think about empathy not as a form of kind of affective mastery, where you gain as much emotional, contextual, and cultural information about another person or group as you can, but rather a process where you become open, even vulnerable enough to yourself become affected by what you experience as foreign? What different kinds of openings and possibilities might be created by that shift in the way we understand empathy? So, in conclusion, I suppose that the key argument my work makes is that empathy, or indeed any emotion, cannot be the solution to complex transnational social inequalities and conflicts, because it's always already bound up with and produced through these very relations of power. And nonetheless, we don't want to dismiss empathy. We continue to desire it. We feel that there's something meaningful or important about it that we don't want to let go. And actually, I think this lure towards empathy might tell us something important. It might tell us something interesting, as the cultural theorist Elspeth Probyn puts it, about our ongoing longing for communication, for touch, for lines of entanglement, for reciprocity. So, in a transnational world that's increasingly characterized by the unequal distribution of life, hope, and endurance, the question of empathy that remains, I think, is what kind of affective relations, entanglements, and reciprocities do we want to imagine, feel, or activate? Thank you very much for listening.